Well, it is great to see everyone this morning. As most of you hopefully know, this year's preaching theme has been joyful endurance. And because of that, I've been doing a lot of study on joy and endurance and how they fit together. And this is obviously entailed Bible study, but also I've done a lot of study in articles and commentaries and blogs and things of that nature. And as I've been digging into people's views on joy and endurance, a couple of underlying questions have surfaced. One of those underlying questions is, how wise is joy? Is it wise to be joyful? And along with that, does joy actually help us endure trials? A number of people have put forth the idea that being joyful through trials, well, that blinds you to the reality and makes it so that you can't properly react to the severity of specific situations. People have asked, well, is joy naive? You know, if you don't know what naivete is, naivete refers to someone who has a almost childlike ignorance of the way the world actually works. And so people ask, well, is someone who has joy naive of how bad the world actually is? And with that, people will ask, well, do we have to ignore reality to be joyful? You know, I see so much pain and suffering around me, so many bad things happening. In order to have joy, do I have to just close my eyes to how bad things are? And while you might argue that some of these questions are born of maybe depression or anxiety, that doesn't discount the importance of those questions. These are legitimate questions that we need to understand and know the answers to. And so this month, going into a new series on the wisdom of joyful endurance. We're going to have 3 sermons and then a break and then 2 or 3 more sermons digging into what the wisdom literature has to say about joyful endurance. So the Psalms, the Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, we might get into Job some, and see, is there wisdom in joyful endurance? And if so, what is it? Now, to have this conversation, we need to set the baseline. And so today, we're going to be establishing who does not have joy according to the wisdom literature. Because once we establish who doesn't have joy, then we can go on and talk about who does have joy and why they have joy and how they have joy and things of that nature. And as I was digging into this topic, it struck me how in the wisdom literature, a lack of joy is not spoken of as being bad. Joy, sorrow, they are both elements of the human condition. But what we're going to see is that there are some reasons that people wouldn't have joy that are because of bad circumstances or bad situations. Others where it is entirely appropriate to not have joy. So, what we're going to do is we're first going to look at people who don't have joy because of bad decisions. We're then going to talk about those who don't have joy because of sorrowful situations. And finally, we're going to talk about those who do not have joy because of the sorrow of wisdom. Now, as we're getting into this, I want each of us to think about our own lives and our experiences of sorrow and joy and compare our lives and our experiences to Scripture to make sure that we are using joy and sorrow in wise fashions. So, let's jump in and talk about those who do not have joy because of bad decisions. Now, the first one that comes to mind when we talk about someone who does not have joy because of bad decisions they've made is the drunkard. Now, drinking is, of course, a hot-button issue in the world and sometimes in the church. And so we need to identify, before we even get into what the Proverbs says about the drunkard, we need to ask why people drink. Why is it that people use alcohol in the first place? Well, some people use alcohol to numb pain. Physical pain, emotional pain, relational pain. They drown themselves in the bottle, as it were. Life is hard, life hurts, and so they use alcohol to numb that pain. Others use alcohol to encourage fun. They want to loosen up. And you see it in the commercials all the time, right? If people are having fun, there's some sort of alcohol in their hands. Bunch of friends get together to hang out, they have to have some wine. Bunch of guys are getting together to go golfing or whatnot, they have to have a beer. And so people think, well, I'm going to use alcohol to encourage fun. Some people use alcohol to relax. You know, they get home from a hard day of work and they're stressed and they're tight and they're anxious, and so they take some wine or some beer or whatever, maybe something harder, so that it relaxes their muscles and they chill out, as it were. Some people drink out of habit. And this one has always been an interesting topic to me. You know, you talk to someone who's just turning 21, they're like, yeah, I'm going to go and I'm going to go buy my first bit of alcohol and it's going to be great. And you ask them why. Well, that's just what adults do. That's what you do when you turn 21. You go and you get drunk. Well, why? It's just what is done. And people get into that habit that, well, adults, when they gather, they drink. And so why am I drinking? I don't know. It's just because everybody else is. It's a habit. It's just what we do. And so let's talk about the wisdom or lack thereof of this and what it does to our joy. Let's look at Proverbs 23. Proverbs 23, verses 29 through 35 are what I might consider the quintessential proverbs on the use of alcohol. Proverbs 23, 29 through 35 states, who has woe? Who has sorrow? Who has contentions? Who has complaining? Who has wounds without cause? Who has redness of eyes? And he gives the answer. Those who linger long over wine, those who go to taste mixed wine. Now, right there, if we're asking who does not have joy, right there he tells us. You notice joy is not in that list. The person who lingers long over wine, who goes to taste mixed wine, has woe, sorrow, contentions, complaining, wounds without cause, and redness of eyes, not joy. What we see in this is that vice in general, and alcohol specifically, makes some promises. Alcohol promises healing, but what it delivers is pain. You know, the person who says, well, I use the drink to numb my pain. Okay, for a moment, it does. For a moment, it numbs the pain. But then the pain comes back. And sometimes with even more pain, because people do dumb things when they're under the influence. And so maybe they cause themselves more injury, or they hurt their relationships even further. So it promises healing, but it delivers pain. It promises fun, but delivers misery. You know, you think about all those commercials we just talked about of people having their alcohol to encourage fun. Well, you ever talk to a heavy drinker on a Monday morning? And, oh, my head hurts, and don't make loud noises, and dim the lights. But then, well, they have all those regrets of dumb things they said to people, injuries they caused to themselves or somebody else. It promises fun, but it delivers misery. It promises relaxation, but it delivers addiction. You know, in the brotherhood, people like to talk about the dangers of social drinking. And absolutely, social drinking has a lot of dangers. But I'd honestly be more concerned about the dangers of secret drinking, closet drinking, drinking alone. Because that person who says, man, I just need that bit of alcohol to relax. Well, you get home from work and you have a beer or a glass of wine, but then soon that doesn't do it, right? So then you need 2. And then you need 3. And then the beer is just not doing it, so you go to something harder. Whiskey or rum or vodka or something of that nature. And pretty soon that's not doing it. That, my friends, is addiction. That's addiction. So it promises relaxation, but it delivers addiction. When someone cannot relax unless they have a substance, that's addiction. And that's dangerous. And so what is the solution given by the writer of these Proverbs? Do not look on the wine when it's red, when it sparkles in the cup, when it goes down smoothly. At the last it bites like a serpent and stings like a viper. I love the answer. The answer isn't, oh, just use a little moderation. The answer isn't, only have one. The answer is don't look at it. Don't go there. Don't let it occupy a space in your mind. Because allowing yourself to view alcohol as a viable option will eventually lead to worse pain. It doesn't increase your joy. It doesn't make your life better. It only leads to worse pain. But that idea of viable options, we all have viable options in our minds to solve problems. Hey, problem A comes up, and I have a litany of things I could do about that problem. Some are viable, some are not. Well, if we allow alcohol to be a viable option in our mind, well, we're heading down the road of pain. He goes on and says, your eyes will see strange things, and your mind will utter perverse things, and you will be like one who lies down in the middle of the sea, or like one who lies down on top of a mast. They struck me, but I did not know it. They struck me, but I did not become ill. They beat me, but I did not know it. When shall I wake? I will seek another drink. Seeking quick fixes in alcohol will only lead to pain and misery in the long run. The quick fix almost never solves the actual problem. So we shouldn't seek quick fixes. We should seek actual solutions. So we see that the drunkard does not have joy because of the bad decision of, drinking. Let's now shift our focus and talk about the man who labors endlessly without dependence. One who doesn't have joy because of this bad decision. Now, someone might say, wait, hold on a second. How is laboring endlessly without dependence a bad decision? Well, laboring endlessly is generally a decision that someone makes. Let's turn to Ecclesiastes 4. Ecclesiastes 4, verses 6 through 8. Now, this is one of those sections that I really could have gone back up to verse 1 and just done through the whole chapter. But for the sake of brevity, we're going to start in verse 6. Verse 6 says, one handful of rest is better than two fists full of labor and striving after the wind. I love this imagery. So the imagery is that this person is holding on to something. They have labor, they have rest. If you have two fists full of labor, you don't have any room for rest or for relaxation. But then if you have two hands full of rest, well, there's no time for labor. There's no room for work. And so he says that it's better to have one handful of rest and one with labor than to have two fists full of labor. We see in this that the wise person will learn to balance rest and labor. They work hard, but they also take rest. They enjoy their life. But why? Well, balance maximizes the joy of productivity and the joy of leisure. Productivity is itself a joyful thing. When you go and you work hard and you accomplish something, that is a joyful thing. But then leisure, when you get to kick back, do something you enjoy, that is also pleasurable. But then you notice people that if they work all the time, they stop taking joy in the work. And they get grumpy. And they get, tired and burned out. They need to take a rest. But then people that only do leisure, they don't work at all. Pretty soon the leisure loses its flair. They stop taking joy in it, and they become depressed or hedonistic. So balance maximizes the joy of both productivity and the joy of leisure. Now there's kind of our baseline. He then gives us an example. He says, then I looked again at vanity under the sun. So something that is empty or worthless. He says there was a certain man without a dependent, having neither a son nor a brother, yet there was no end to all his labor. So he paints us a picture of a person who doesn't have anyone depending on them. Now, to understand why he says that this is a vanity under the sun, we have to understand that laboring to provide for a family provides its own type of joy. There is great joy in knowing that your labor is providing for somebody. Whether it be a spouse and children or your parents or some other family member who needs your help, there is a legitimate, deep-seated kind of joy in providing for others. So why would someone toil endlessly if they don't have family to provide for? no breaks, no days off, just working on through when they don't have someone to provide for. Well, he gives us the answer. He says, indeed, his eyes were not satisfied with riches, and he never asked, for whom am I laboring and depriving myself of pleasure? He says, this too is vanity and a grievous task. So this person, their eyes weren't satisfied with riches, and they never paused to consider what they were doing. So why someone might toil endlessly, it might be because of greed. They want the almighty dollar. And we've probably all either known people like this, or at least know of people like this, who they've got a great paying job, they work long hours, they don't have a family, maybe they're unmarried, and they have cool stuff, maybe 2 or 3 houses, maybe the coolest cars and coolest boat or whatever. But their boat always stays parked at the dock and their cars always stay in the garage because they spend all their time at the office working. Their vacation home stays empty because they never go on vacation. They don't use their timeshare because they never go on vacation. Because the dollar signs are what fill their mind. But maybe someone is toiling endlessly with the expectation of future family. You think about a single guy who's not yet married, but he wants to be married, and he's going to fill his time with work so he gets a good nest egg. And that's a very worthy idea. But again, there's that idea of balance. How are you going to meet someone to marry so you can provide for them if all you ever do is work? How are you going to be interesting to someone if all you ever do is work? How are you going to spend time with them if all you ever do is work? And so still that balance is necessary. But someone also might toil endlessly because of social pressure. Society tells them, whether it's society of the country or their community or whatever it may be, says that, hey, you need to work hard or you're worthless. And this may even happen as peer pressure from, older family members who, speak very negatively of that person who takes a vacation twice a year. And so you might get the impression that you have to work all the time or there's something wrong with you. See, endless toil when one has no dependence needlessly deprives a person of enjoyment. If you don't have dependence, you don't have someone to take care of, well, take some time, enjoy your life. He says that this needless depriving yourself of enjoyment, he says this too is vanity, and it's a grievous task. It doesn't serve a purpose. It's not helpful. So my friends, if you don't have dependence, work hard, but take time to enjoy your life. And in fact, if you do have dependence, work hard, but take time to enjoy life. Get out there, have a hobby, explore the mountains, jump on a motorcycle or car and take a road trip. Enjoy your life because it's going to be fleeting. So we see people who don't have joy because of bad decisions. Let's now shift our focus and talk about those who do not have joy because of sorrowful situations. Quite frankly, there are some situations that are just not joyful. Let's talk about the land that is governed by fools. Ecclesiastes 10. Ecclesiastes 10, verses 16 through 17. Ecclesiastes 10, 16 and 17 says, "Woe to you, O land, whose king is a lad and whose princes feast in the morning." Now, this idea of feasting in the morning is one that maybe doesn't connect with our culture. The idea is not eating a big breakfast so that you have energy for the day. The idea here is like a drunken feast, where they're getting drunk and wasting their day first thing. Well, those princes aren't going to be getting anything done. They're not going to be governing the people. And an entire community may not have joy if they're under foolish leadership. You think about a country, or whether it's a country or a town or some smaller community, but their leaders are fools. Well, under foolish leadership, disorganization is the norm. Who's doing what? There's a problem, but no one knows who's supposed to fix it. Things go unaddressed. And so frustration festers. People see problems, but they don't know who's going to take care of it or who even should take care of it. And so then discontent flourishes. People are discontent, they're grumbling, they're upset, and misery goes unaddressed. Those problems that people face just keep festering. And so joy withers. Now we might say, well, an individual should be able to pursue joy despite the bad situations they find themselves in. And yeah, on an individual basis, sure. But by and large, a community under foolish leadership is going to experience a distinct lack of joy. And so then he gives us the other side. He said, "Blessed are you, O land, whose king is of nobility, and whose princes eat at the appropriate time, for strength and not for drunkenness." So the idea of leadership that is not out to glorify themselves and not out to just have a party all the time, but they're truly trying to do the best for their people. See, under wise leadership, a community is free to pursue joy. You think about that American dream, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Okay, if the leadership is wise and is governing the way they ought to govern, then people can be free to pursue joy, to seek fulfillment. So we see that the land itself, the community, may have sorrow or a lack of joy because of foolish leadership. We also see that someone may not have joy simply because the sorrow as a natural result of some situations. There's some everyday situations that you're just not joyful. Let's turn to Proverbs 14, verse 13. Proverbs 14, verse 13. And it says, "Even in laughter, the heart may be in pain, and the end of joy may be grief." You know, one of the things I love about the Proverbs is how they're not relegated to just one specific situation. This concept, this truism, could be applied to many different situations because many situations are both joyful and sorrowful. They're tinged with both joy and sadness. I'll give you some examples. Let's think about a family gathering. You know, you gather the family together, you have grandparents and aunts and uncles and cousins and grandkids all together. It's joyful because of the shared love. You get to spend time with these people that you love and appreciate. But there may also be sorrow because of absent loved ones. You know, someone who has passed away. Maybe someone who's still living, but they're having health issues, so they couldn't come. Maybe someone who isn't there because they've alienated themselves from the family. Or maybe the family has alienated them. And so you have joy because of the people you get to see and spend time with, but you also have sorrow because of those absent loved ones. Joy tinged with sorrow. And in that situation, neither is bad. Joy is not bad. The sorrow is not bad. Neither is better or more important. They just both are. Now, what you do with them, that really makes an impact, because if you allow yourself to only think about the negative and drop into the despair, that's probably not healthy. If you refuse to acknowledge those who are not with you and you refuse to acknowledge the possible sorrow, that's also not helpful. They both have their place. Or think about a wedding. I love weddings. Weddings are so much fun to be part of. They're joyful because the start of a new chapter of life. You know, two young people, or maybe not so young people, joining their lives together. No longer under their parents' households, but starting their own household. But it's also sorrowful because the ending of the previous chapter of life. They're no longer going to be in their parents' households. Those dynamics are going to change. And there's some sorrow in that. There's joy, but there's sorrow. And again, neither is better. Neither is bad. The joy is warranted and good. The sorrow is warranted and healthy. They both exist. Think about the funeral of a Christian. I've done a number of funerals over the years, and the best to do are the funerals of faithful Christians. because you have joy knowing that they've reached their eternal rest. You can be joyful for them that they are no longer suffering, but they are with their master. But there's also sorrow because they're no longer with us. Now, sometimes the sorrow might outweigh the joy some. The joy may be more of an intellectual exercise, and the sorrow may be more of an emotional exercise. But they both still exist. You feel that sorrow, but you know the joy. Neither is better, neither is bad. They just both are. Think about even then, maybe the start of a new friendship. That's joyful because of the new possibilities for the future. Hey, you make a new friend, you meet somebody, there's all sorts of possibility of this relationship, this friendship growing into something great. But there's also sorrow because the possibility of loss and betrayal. Every time you make a new friend, there's the possibility that relationship will end, that friendship will dissolve. So there's joy, there's also sorrow, even in something as simple as making a new friend. And so what do? If there are these situations that are both joyful and sorrowful, well, the plain fact of the matter is that accepting that many situations are both joyful and sorrowful is healthy. Accepting the fact that, yes, there are going to be situations that are sad but also happy, that are joyful but also sorrowful. And allowing ourselves to feel those emotions, to feel the joy, but also to feel the sorrow. That balance is healthy. Now let's talk about one who doesn't have joy because they've sired a fool. Now this is kind of a different situation from what we were just talking about. Let's go and turn to Proverbs 17. Proverbs 17:21. Reads, "He who sires a fool does so to his sorrow, and the father of a fool has no joy." Now, as I was doing this study, my initial search in my Bible software was just a search of no joy or lack of joy in the wisdom literature. And there's very few passages that directly say this person does not have joy. But this is one of them. The father of a fool has no joy. So the question becomes, whose fault is this? As I was looking at this, I was asking myself, do I put this in the category of making bad decisions, having no joy because of a bad decision? Because it could be the parent's fault for not raising them right. A parent might have fallen down on their job, been abusive or neglectful or actively taught bad things, and the person becomes a fool, the child becomes a fool because of their parents' training. That is entirely possible. But it could also be the child's fault for making foolish decisions. There are situations where parents did a good job. They weren't abusive, they weren't neglectful, they taught them good godly lessons, but the child still made decisions that were foolish. So it could be the parent's fault, it could be the child's fault, or it may be both. Maybe the parents made some mistakes, and the child made some mistakes, and now the child is a fool. Either way, the parent of a fool feels great sorrow watching their child constantly make bad decisions. That is a distinctly not joyful situation. And it's interesting because Proverbs like this don't really give a solution. There's not really because of this is what you need to do now. The lesson is kind of a front-end lesson that, okay, parents, strive to raise people who are not fools. So we see that fact, though, that the one who sires a fool has no joy. And that brings us to our final area of discussion for today. We've talked about those who do not have joy because of bad decisions. We've talked about those who do not have joy because of sorrowful situations. Let's now talk about those who do not have joy because the sorrow of wisdom. And this is an interesting concept. Let's talk about the wise and knowledgeable for a minute. Turn with me to Ecclesiastes 1, verses 16 through 18. Ecclesiastes 1, 16 through 18. Now, this is still Solomon's introduction to the book, and he's talking of himself. He said, I said to myself, behold, I have magnified and increased wisdom more than all who were over Jerusalem before me, and my mind has observed a wealth of wisdom and knowledge. Now, that's true. Solomon was blessed by God with supernatural wisdom. And so he says this. He says, I set my mind to know wisdom and to know madness and folly. I realize that this also is striving after the wind, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. Now, something that's always struck me about verse 17, knowing madness and folly from a academic standpoint would be good, but the experiential knowledge he's talking of here, we shouldn't seek out to experientially know madness and folly. That's not a good idea. We don't have to experience madness to know the danger of madness. But he says he set out to experientially know wisdom, madness, and folly. And then he makes that statement in verse 18, because in much wisdom there is much grief, and increasing knowledge results in increasing pain. I've had people take this passage and throw it at me as kind of an accusation, saying, see, I ought not gain knowledge, I ought not grow in maturity, I ought not become wise, because then I'm just going to be full of grief and pain. And so they say, I'm going to stay ignorant, and I'm going to stay foolish, because then I don't have to deal with the pain. Well, that's not really what Solomon is saying here. He's not saying, hey, stay ignorant and foolish. But let's talk about why. Why is it that in much wisdom there is much grief, and in increasing knowledge results in increasing pain? Why is that? Well, it's because the wise person, they see the bad along with the good. You know, they see the whole picture, as it were. So something good is happening, but they also see that there's bad going on elsewhere. The wise person sees the cost of success. Hey, this person may be doing well in business, but the wise person sees that to get there they had to neglect their family. They see that, hey, this person may have lots of money, but the wise person also sees that they had to sacrifice their time. And there's always a cost to success. And the wise person knows that. The wise person, they can project possible outcomes of actions, some of which will be painful. And this is a interesting dynamic to watch, because you'll see someone who's older and wise talking to a young person and saying, well, be careful. If you do this, there's a good chance that this is going to come about. And the young person will often say, no, not for me. It's going to be different for me. And that wise person, they can't force the young person to make a wise decision. They have sorrow because they have to sit back and say, okay, I warned you, and then watch events play out as they predicted, because they know how events play out. And there's sorrow in that, seeing that people that you care about, who you have warned, make bad decisions and the negative results come about. The wise person also sees the whole picture, where others only see part. You know, someone who's not quite as wise, they see their sliver of the situation. The wise person has the capacity to see the other angles, the other parts of that situation. And so they're looking at the whole big picture and seeing how things could be good or bad as the situation changes. So with these ideas and these concepts then being registered, does this mean that a wise person is doomed to be miserable? That the wiser the person is, that they're just going to be a miserable individual? And I've had people state that to me, that they're always negative and pessimistic because they see the reality of things. Well, I would say no. No, this isn't the case, because the wise person also knows how to maintain joy despite the pain. I would even go as far as to argue that if you see those realities, but you don't know how to maintain joy, you're knowledgeable, absolutely. You're informed, yes, but you may not be wise yet. Because the wise person also knows how to maintain their joy despite the pain. That's part of what makes them wise. And I love seeing this in action. When you see someone, one of those beloved older family members or members of the church, who in one moment, they're expressing the great grief with someone who's hurting. And then they turn to this other person and they're expressing the great joy that this person is seeing in their life. And they can feel both of those. They see both of those. They are there in the moment with both of those. Because they have the wisdom to handle each person and each situation as it is and do the right thing in that moment. So we see a goal here. As we're talking about wisdom, there is that goal to become that wise person who sees the good and the bad, who experiences the joy and the sorrow, who balances the work and the leisure, so that we can be that wise person who, while we see the sorrow, we also see the pain, or we see the joy, I should say. So, today, as we've been discussing, who does not have joy according to the wisdom literature? We've seen that those who make bad decisions often don't have joy. We see those who don't have joy because of the sorrow of some situations. We've seen those who do not have joy because of the sorrow of wisdom. Now, to be honest, if we were to leave this sermon right here and just stop, it might be kind of a downer. Talking about sorrow and then just being like, well, we're done. So to close out our sermon, I want to look at one of Solomon's conclusions to Ecclesiastes. Solomon really has 2 or maybe 3 conclusions to Ecclesiastes. He has a conclusion that is spiritual in the end of chapter 12. But in chapter 11, he has a conclusion that is more experiential, more about this life. We're going to pick up Ecclesiastes 11, verse 8, and read on through the rest of the chapter. Ecclesiastes 11, verse 8, Solomon writes, "Indeed, if a man should live many years," okay, he's just talked about all sorts of things that are folly, that are foolish, that are vanity. And you might expect his conclusion to be like, well, give up, because it's all empty. But look at what he says. "Indeed, if a man should live many years, let him rejoice in them all." Now, is he being ignorant and just ignoring the fact that bad things are going to happen? No, he says, let him rejoice in them all. And let him remember the days of darkness, for they will be many. Everything that is to come will be futility. Isn't that interesting? The days of darkness are going to be many. There's going to be a lot of bad times. So what should you do? Enjoy every moment of your life that you can. Because ultimately, everything that is to come will be futility. Okay, if all of life is futility, might as well enjoy it, because it's going to end. And then he says this, he says, "Rejoice, young man, during your childhood, and let your heart be pleasant during the days of your young manhood, and follow the impulses of your heart and the desires of your eyes. Yet know that God will bring you to judgment for all these things." So he gives advice to the young people. Okay, young men, young people, go have adventures. Explore the world. Find out what you're interested in. But do so morally, knowing that God will bring you to judgment. So don't indulge in sin. Don't explore, sin and evil and all that. But go, explore, seek things that you're interested in and pursue them. Because youth is fleeting. He says, so remove grief and anger from your heart and put away pain from your body, because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. So, since there's vanity in everything. Since life is short, should we wallow in a pit of despair and say life is pointless and meaningless? Why was I even born? Just strike me down? No. He says remove grief and anger from your heart. Get rid of it. It's not helping you. Remove pain from your body. Okay, if you can avoid pain, do so. Because childhood and the prime of life are fleeting. When we put all these things together, we see that sorrow has its place. Absolutely. Sorrow is an essential part of the human condition. But joy also has its place. Joy is also an essential element of the human condition. Both are important. Both are important aspects of our lives. But both can also be misused. It is possible to misuse sorrow and let yourself fall into a pit of despair even when joy is warranted. It's also possible to misuse joy and ignore the reality of situations, and maybe sometimes even cause more pain when you should be sorrowing with somebody who has experienced loss. Both are important, but both can be misused. So my friends, seek to use both joy and sorrow appropriately and in godly wisdom. Learn that godly wisdom so you can have joy when joy is warranted, even when life is hard, and have sorrow when sorrow is warranted, but not let it swallow you. In that is wisdom. Now today as we are closing out our sermon time, possibly you have a need. Maybe there's some struggle in your life. Maybe there's some sin that you know that you've been indulging, and you need the prayers and the support of the congregation. We're here for you. Not to ridicule or scorn, but to support you and help you to grow. Maybe you're with us and you're not yet a Christian. You would like to learn how to become a Christian or take those steps. We want to facilitate that. Maybe you're watching with us online, and while you're not here in the room, you feel convicted in some way. If you're here with us in the room, obviously, when we sing our invitation song in a minute, come up to the front. One of our elders will come speak with you. If you're watching online, contact us. Email, phone call, Facebook, Messenger. We want to hear from you. So if you have a need, please let me know as Howard leads us in this invitation song.
Thank you for watching. For a deeper study of God's Word, contact us through our website in the description of this video. Lakes Region Church of Christ invites you and your family to Bible classes for all ages on Sunday morning, and join us for worship. We also offer other scheduled Bible classes. See you soon.